Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another episode of ENO8 Answers. I'm here today with Craig Mertens from our team. He's one of our solutions architect and is a terrific person to work with. I really enjoy working with Craig. I think he's got a awesome set of experiences building products for small companies and large companies, simple and complex. And I just think that the conversation that we have lined up today should probably be pretty interesting and hopefully resonate with a lot of you. Hey, Craig.
Hey, Jeff. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, we've been looking forward to doing this. We've been trying to set up a time to get together and kind of talk about the topic that we have today for a while. And I think it's going to be a good one. You know, I think software projects or product development it's notoriously known for having problems or high failure rates. And, you know, I think one of the big themes that we try to focus on is that it doesn't really have to be that way. And so what we wanted to connect on today is sort of talking about, you know, product teams that are underperforming or projects that are failing. What are some of the common themes that we've seen in the past in different scenarios? And, you know, how have we approached that in the past? And really just try to lift the curtain a little bit on, you know, when you're unhappy with how a product development effort is going, what are the things you look for? What kinds of things are common? And more importantly, how do you make changes to resolve that so that you can get into a place where, you know, you're really satisfied with sort of the quality of product that you're building and the pace and that kind of thing. So I think it's going to be a good conversation. So we'll kind of dive in. I think, you know, why don't we start with, you know, just talking a little bit about some of the more common themes. Like if you think back about a lot of the projects that you've been involved with, a lot of the product development efforts that you've been involved with, what are some of the things that are repetitive or that come up a lot that you think sort of lead to problems?
Yeah. Well, you know, as you and I have talked about frequently, we've often said the same thing, which is with technology programs and projects, and especially sort of ground up technology builds, it's really rarely the technology that becomes the primary risk. It's the governance around it.
Right.
You know, generally speaking, and there are exceptions certainly as you kind of move up the complexity stack. But in general, you know, no technology decision is a make or break. And people tend to focus on it, right? It's, you know, what languages are we going to use? What tech stack are we going to use? What's our approach going to be? But realistically, you know, projects live or die by the governance around it. And that's not just project management. That's the design, which I think is one of the places where ENO8 really shines. It's understanding upfront, what are your risks? What are the assumptions going in? How do you connect with the business, whether that's the internal users or the external stakeholders, and really understanding their requirements.
When we talk about governance, let's talk a little bit about what do we mean there. I think at a super high level, governance is sort of what's known as like the triple constraint, right? Like scope, timeline, and budget. A lot of the things that you were talking about a second ago were like pretty tied to the scope element of that, you know, and I think that's important. That's a big one, right? Scope goes way beyond just documenting some basic requirements. Like tell us more about like governance. What does that mean to you? Like for those that may not know, what is governance?
That's true. Well, you know, I think that's a great point, starting with the iron triangle, right? Because inevitably, somewhere you're not going to have flex, whether it's the budget, whether it's the timeline, or whether it's the scope. Generally, in commercial projects, certainly scope is maybe a little easier to work with if you could be creative. But inevitably, there are budget constraints, there are time constraints. And when we talk about solutioning, you know, I've got architect in my title. I've had it in for years. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm doing a lot of sort of hands-on technology architecture. I often say I'm less an architect, more of a city planner.
Okay.
And solutioning is really about looking at those constraints, looking at those requirements, and saying, how do we successfully deliver within those boundaries?
Right.
And that's where governance starts, right? Governance starts with, what are we attempting to do? Can we achieve it? Are we being realistic? And what does it look like to get there? Right. And you know, technologists, I mean, you know, I'm a technologist. I've spent years doing software development. I understand this very well because I live this. We want to get right to the code, right? We want to start. And it's and that's true of a lot of business owners too, right? I mean, if you're owning a project, you want to start seeing things come out immediately. But in the metaphor that I like to give is in orbital mechanics, if you slow down, right? If you're going around the planet and you slow down, then you drop down closer to the Earth and you start going faster. And that's sort of what governance is, right? Governance is slowing down to go faster.
Right.
And so taking a moment up front to be able to say, okay, what are the risks that we have? What are the assumptions we're making? What are the requirements going in? What can't be moved? Where do we have flex? Where can we work with the business owners to change things, to be a little more creative about how we get there? It's a lot less of the technology, really, and a lot more of operations and strategy and understanding how we play into it. Because end of the day, as you know, everything we do has to be in service of the organization's goals.
Yep.
Which really comes down to just straight up, it's straight up revenue and profitability.
Right.
And when you connect to that, then why are we doing it, right? Why are we taking the time? Why are we taking the money?
Yeah.
Why are we building software if not to meet those goals? So a lot of governance is really understanding those goals and building them in a sane, safe, and sensible way.
Agreed. I kind of want to circle back to sort of like how we started on this topic is in that the governance, you sort of jump to the heart of things. I think a lot of times, like my mind goes to scope as one of the first suspects. Like if something's not going well, like I hone in on scope first, like typically trying to figure out, is there even a clear scope defined? You'd be surprised how many times the scope isn't really well defined. It's often just swirling around in someone's head, like usually the product owner or whoever's in charge of the overall effort. In a startup, it might be a founder. They have a concept of scope in their head, and that's kind of what they're going off of, but that's definitely not enough. And you mentioned technology is the one that most people will tend to point to pretty quickly. And I see that happen all the time where they point to it's a technology problem, which can quickly turn into, well, it's really the developer problem. Like it's the technology, but we have bad developers and they're not doing the right things. And a lot of times that looks like that on the surface, but my experience has been that most of the time when we think that it's the developers / the technology, it's really not, right? Like they don't have a clear target to hit. And if they don't have a clear target to hit, there's nothing they can do that's going to be able to stay in line with expectations. And sadly, that's not realized. It's the tech that gets the attention, or it's the specific developers that get the attention, and they end up solving the wrong problem, right? Just to repeat itself.
You make a really good point at the beginning of that, which is a lot of times, when we start a project, the scope is inside somebody's head, or it's maybe even a little further out, right? It's sort of, we know what our customers want or need, and we just sort of gesture to it and try to build on top of it. Agile, as useful as it is, it tends to paper over a lot of those issues. And I'm not saying we go back to where we were, in the 80s or 90s. I mean, I started my career in telecommunications, and, we would do 9 months of planning before anything, right? We'd have a 300-page design document, and no one would ever refer to it.
Right. Or know it existed a lot of times.
We don't want to go back to like naive waterfall. But it's also the case of there's a lot of decisions that you can't make kind of within the agile release cadence. You have to make them up front. You have to understand them, and you have to build around those constraints. I say, technology is rarely a problem. I'm going to actually go back and make one exception to that. Data can be the problem.
Tell us about that. What do you mean by that?
Data it's the reification of those requirements. It's the reification of the business knowledge, how things connect together, right? If we talk about things like domain-oriented design and the like, right? It's really about saying, what is the business's understanding of the world, and how to translate that into data? Data is the hardest thing to pull out of a project. Once you decide what your objects are, your classes, your data records, once you start storing data and managing data, that's very, very difficult to back out, as opposed to things like, traditional line of business code, which is operating on data kind of in motion. Well, as you're moving the data around, you can do a lot with that over time. But the way you store data I'll give you a couple of simple examples here.
Yeah, please.
So I've done my share of kind of big ERP projects, right? I mean, coming out of sort of the big corporate side, big government side, right? A lot of SAP, Oracle, JD Edwards type stuff. Every one of those, I don't care which ERP system you're looking at, every one of them has what I call kind of the foundational metaphor of the system. So, for example, if it's SAP is basically an accounting system for all intents and purposes, and everything looks like it looks like a contract or it looks like a chart of accounts. Like JD Edwards, it was more of a job shop scheduling system at the beginning, and everything kind of looks like a job shop. It looks like a ticket. And so to work with those systems, and this is where your choice of technology can have downstream effects. SFDC, right? Everything kind of looks like a sales pipeline in a certain way. Those are metaphors that are baked very deep into the system. And you have to understand those metaphors because when you start designing your system around those sort of rich ecosystems of data, you need to understand how they're organized, how they think, because you are, as opposed to kind of pure, bottoms-up software development, you're sort of connecting yourself to somebody else's metaphor. So that's one way, certainly one way to look at it. And then another example, I'll give you kind of a second one, which is the same business will look at the same things differently. Oil and gas, right? I've done, quite a bit of oil and gas, and the concept of an oil well, right? A physical oil well, right? Okay, we're going to have this oil well out there, right? You can go to the, Western Gulf of Mexico, you can go out there, you can fly around it. It's a physical thing. It's a tangible thing. But depending on who you're talking to in the business, it's a very, very different thing. Upstream exploration sees it in terms of the geology. Production sees it in terms of flow rate. Accounting is going to see it as, a set of costs and revenue. Well, everyone's looking at these physical things differently. And that's one of I think, the most important things of solutions architecture and building these sort of solutions is saying, okay, we're not working with the physical thing out there in the world. We're working with the business representation of it and unifying that in terms of the data. What does the data look like? Where's it stored? How are we operating on it?
Interesting.
And those are very, very big ticket decisions.
So let's talk about that. So if you think, let's focus on small business, right? Like whether it's a startup building a new, SaaS product as an example, or maybe it's a growth stage software company, and they hear this episode and they hear us talk about, data. What would be something you would recommend to them that they could take inventory of or assess internally to understand whether they have a good grip on data or they're going down the right path from a data standpoint? What comes to mind?
It all begins with kind of the classic service design effort, whether that's led internally or externally. Again, that's something that, we do at ENO8. It's something we've done at Fjord, Frog Design, right? I mean, there's not that many shops that do it and do it well, but it's a very fundamental approach. And more than anything, that's about sociology and it's about knowledge transfer. And that's an interesting thing, right? I mean, what we're really saying is that the most important thing is not the code. It's not the database, right? Really, the most important thing from the outset is understanding your people, your customers, your processes, the way they look at the world, the way you look at the world, and turning that into something actionable. That's classic service design. That's getting out and doing interviews. That's ethno-methodological field research, right? Getting out and sort of the old management by walking around. Same thing with consulting. You got to get out, you got to walk around, because otherwise, sort of classically, right? How many software systems have we seen? How many have we used that, fit that, mythical 400 or 500 page systems design document, but didn't solve a single problem?
Right.
Everything was hashed out in a conference room with, 24 people, none of whom were actually supposed to be using this thing on a daily basis. So that's the very first thing. The very first thing is really burning in the effort. Even if you think you know your business, right? There's a lot of tacit knowledge. The classic, I was working with a company once, and it started as a technical issue, right? I mean, this was a company that essentially came to us and said, hey, I really want to, we really want to be able to manage documents. We're doing large scale project estimating, right? There's a lot of engineering work. There's a lot of financial work. Right now, we're just sort of sending, spreadsheets back and forth and Word documents and PowerPoints. We really just need like a standard place to track all that. That's pretty bread and butter, right? It's document management. We've seen it in oil and gas. We've seen it in, private equity and a number of places, right? That's sort of a standard thing. Well, this design effort really changed our view of the problem. And we came back and we said, well, look, I mean, we can absolutely make software, design software, build software that's going to make this better. No question. But you have two problems. And they were separate issues that we took on as separate projects as part of this, coming out of the discussion with the CEO. The first one was, he said, when we look at your spreadsheets, again, looking at the data, understanding how is everyone looking at these physical objects through time and space. And we said, look, you've got a whole part of the system where essentially you go from what is supposed to be very hard-nosed, quantitative engineering-led estimation to being able to kind of put your thumb on the scales, right? Here's this spreadsheet, and over here, you can sort of put your thumb on the scale and say, well, despite what all this says, it's actually going to be a lot more complex, a lot more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And the culture of the organization was such, it was an engineering-led culture. And essentially, if you went over time, if you went over budget, you were hauled in front of a committee. You were absolutely beaten down. And what we heard talking to people, these are line engineers, principal engineers, right? We're talking to everybody from the folks doing the hands-on work all the way up to people managing billions of dollars in spend. And everybody said the same thing. We don't want that. It's terrible for your career, right? The only way the only way that you rise in the organization is by being the smartest engineer in the room. And that's black marks on your record. So everybody put their thumb on the scale. And at the end of the day, everyone came back and said, look, we're so efficient. We're 10% over budget every single time. And we could say, well, yeah, that's because you're putting 10 or 15% over budget right here. And the discussion that we had with them was really not, hey, this shouldn't be done. It's, hey, why are you taking your engineers and punishing them for your model being low? Your model, the way you're handling the data is the problem. Brilliant. I mean, this was an organization that had, I couldn't even tell you how many data scientists, but none of them were attached to engineering estimation. So we're looking at this and saying, well, you know what, we're going to go off and we're just going to start with some basic multivariate linear regressions and let's see how close we get. And we immediately started saving, this is about $160 million a year in profit that particular project came out with.
Oh, wow.
And that's, and not because they were more efficient, it's because they weren't encumbering a budget that wasn't going to get spent that year. So they had $1 billion of extra spend every year that could go into engineering production, which, at their ROIC would generate about 160 million, if I remember correctly. But that was a great, data was the problem. The way they were looking at the data, the way they were analyzing the data. And the second part was the culture, right? This culture of fear. And talking to the CEO, that particular, it's a multi-business unit CEO, but he said, well, I think that explains a problem I have. Every time I want data, it takes them 4 months to get it to me. I just want one piece of data, and they bring me a binder. And he said, here, well, yeah, because he wasn't walking around. He wasn't talking to these people. He wasn't understanding how the processes were working, what was the culture, and where did the culture have problems. So I bring that all around to say, one, the way that the data is analyzed, the way the data is managed, defines a lot of this project, right? We could have gone down the road of, great, we're going to do a bunch of document management stuff, and fine, there would have been value. But not as much value as being able to say, oh, wait, hold on, your core suppositions are wrong, right? Yeah. Look at the data. Look at what it's telling you. Talk to your people. Listen to what they're telling you.
Yeah.
And
it's interesting, your answer, Craig, like I when you said data and we talked about like what would they look for, I was almost expecting some answer around like, some kind of form of documentation, like a data contract or some database design, that kind of thing. But really what it sounds like you're talking about, this is much more like zoomed out strategic level, like understanding the process that you're actually automating, the process you're automating, the business case, the flow of the entire sort of process or journey, in order to inform how you need to manage or capture data. Am I hearing you right?
Definitely right. By the time you get down to the tactical questions, and if you're looking like, ENO8's minimal viable analytics, right?
Yep.
Measurement design, right? Those are all very tactical. That's about building your data dictionary. That's about describing, all the way down to allowable mathematical operations, right? Being very, very precise on what are we measuring? How do we measure it? And what does it mean?
Yeah.
And that's critical, right? Because it's easily skipped over. But absolutely, you have to start at the macro level. You have to start all the way up and understand through the scope of the business, what are these things? How are they viewed by different parts of the business? How do they ultimately exist within a value driver tree that is going to flow to the most important part, which is how do you make money, right? What's your revenue? What's your income?
And I think one thing that I'm thinking about as you're talking is it's not enough to just know what that process should be or what you intend to build in terms of software to sort of meet that need. You have to think it through at a little bit deeper level, so then you know how to build something that works well. And so what I've seen a lot of times, especially in small teams, especially like a startup company, is that maybe you have a founder who really understands the customer and the use case really, really well. And they go right to getting developers. So they're communicating their vision for all of this directly to the developers, but there's really a pretty big step in between those two to process or synthesize that vision and the awareness of the journey and the use case into something that's really baked out, that's really ready for developers to build.
Yeah, now we're really down to the nuts and bolts of that service design effort, right? What are the features into it? What are the requirements? What are the constraints, risks, and assumptions, right? And it's so easy to lose track of those. Or alternatively, it's also very easy to go a little too far and start saying, okay, how are we going to build this, right? We're just going to go right to Jira tickets.
Yep.
And the risk there is that you have all of these kind of uncaptured knowledge points that don't make it in. And in service design, we talk a lot about tacit knowledge, right? This is knowledge that exists within the organization, but it's not written down. The only way you know about it is by getting out and talking to people and watching the processes and turning those into captured requirements. And that's a risk for any project, right? Tacit knowledge can essentially render any software, in any software project, really almost unviable because you can find solving the wrong problem.
Yeah. If we talk a second about, because I'd like to go even deeper in on this to something that we could really talk about that's nuts and bolts. And so if we think about, this service design concept and trying to really flush out the sort of deeper levels of thoughtfulness that needs to go into making sure you build something the right way, do you have any favorite artifacts or representations of that? I mean, I've seen sort of a lot of different representations that have been used before. I've seen Figma prototypes that are annotated. So they've got like all of the sort of data references and everything throughout the prototype. I'm a huge fan of design prototypes. I think it really helps sort of get clear on what exactly is this going to look like when we build it. And I've seen people annotate, sort of the data references and those types of things within the prototype. In your mind, what are some of your favorite sort of artifacts or representations of sort of when you can pull that stuff together in some sort of tangible form?
I do love annotated Figmas. The caveat there is that's pretty far down the design process, right? By the time you're doing up, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those friction points. Because design and data is a friction point. There's a lot of those kind of levers and joints that can become kind of problematic. But I love that sort of thing because, when you have a Figma prototype, whether it's clickable prototype, a happy path visual prototype, it's something tangible that you can tear apart and really start asking the question of, okay, what happens next? Or what happens next?
Right. Yeah.
So that's definitely a favorite. Value driver trees, I think, are very, very clarifying. That's an exercise where we basically start at sort of the final outputs of the company, which is generally basically revenue, costs, and profitability, right?
Okay.
You start with that on one side, and then what you end up doing is you start building all of the inputs and you create this large tree that basically says, what are all the levers that drive these ultimate values? And I always find that one clarifying, because when you start changing scope and trying to figure out where you're really going to connect your scope in, that can be a very useful exercise because it tells you where you're drawing those lines, right?
Yeah.
This doesn't. And I rarely has that exercise, I think, not created some new insight and clarity for people who are involved in it. There's a whole bunch of classic kind of software requirements that go into this Ishikawa diagrams and things like that again are all about, connecting functional scopes in.
And they vary by scope and scale, right? If you're building a really complex enterprise grade product that's kind of big in scale, you're going to approach that with different types of artifacts than you would if it's a fairly small scope mobile app project, right? And so I think finding what's the most important thing is that you're thoughtful about it and that you've got a representation of it in some form that you've really dug into deep enough that's appropriate for sort of the scale and complexity of what you're about to tackle.
I mean, end of the day, the most important artifact that you've got is the humble sticky note.
Right?
There's nothing more important at the end of the day.
Or that it's even written down at all. You'd be surprised how much written down in any form is better than in somebody's head. And you'd be shocked how much the definition is still inside somebody's head. So it's almost, in some respects, the tool or the style of representation isn't as important as it is represented in some format that is static, right?
You kind of made that point here, and I think it's definitely worth revisiting kind of multiple times, which is a lot of times and this is just human nature, right? We think that we understand the scope of what we're trying to build, even though it's not written down. We have vision, right? And you see this in startups certainly a lot, right? I have a vision for a thing, and that thing is probably the right vision. But there's a lot of subway stops between here and there that if you don't have it written down, if you don't have it formalized, if you don't have it categorized, you really don't know what you're getting into. And that's a challenge. And I think it's a very normal one, right? It's very normal, especially, startups where the mindset is we're going to be agile and we're just going to start building. And right, if you can afford that, if you can afford lots and lots of iterations and lots of code spikes, okay, that's an option. But the bigger your vision, the harder that is. And, I've seen that, I've seen that in startups and I've seen it in very large companies where let's move very, very quickly to development. Let's skip over these intervening steps. And, the end result is, you go over time, you go over budget, you're cutting scope in places where you probably shouldn't cut it. But that's a huge challenge, and it's a very human one. I think we all have this. It's a bit like it's a bit like the meme, right? How to draw an owl, draw two circles, now draw the rest of the owl.
Yes.
That's kind of, the rest of the owl is the problem.
Yeah. And we kind of we kind of started off with this one, this element of it. I mean, there's lots of different reasons that projects fail. We kind of jumped to one that is largely a common root of a lot of other symptoms. You just mentioned timeline. You just mentioned budget. I would often say that, a false budget or a budget that's not adequate for the scope of what you're trying to tackle is a problem. But really, you could probably make an argument that you can trace a budget problem to a scoping problem. Because if you scope properly, then you know what budget you need. And not always, you're not always going to get that right. Even if you do a great job scoping, there's going to be surprises most of the time. However, budget problems very frequently are tied to scoping problems. Do you agree?
I think that's very, very true. And, I'll say, we talked about the iron triangle, but there really is one more side to that. Maybe it's just sitting in the middle where it connects everything, but it's risk, because budget is also inherently tied to risk.
Right.
The more certainty you need, then you're starting to look at time, you're looking at budget. And that's a question that, every organization needs to answer that in their own way, right? Is it, we're a small organization, we don't have a lot of budget. we're willing to assume the risk we're going to go over time. We're going to assume the risk that we're going to go over budget.
Yeah.
Or is it, no, really, we need to trade off predictability and certainty, at which point you really wrap a lot more governance around it. And the truth is, for any organization, right, internal, external, whatever, that's a key decision that kind of shapes everything. There's a lot of organizations out there, right? We're in a global economy, a global services economy. You can go anywhere in the world. And there's a lot of organizations out there that basically don't meaningfully take risk into account. And they look very...
I like that you pointed that out, because that's definitely one that's easy to forget about. Because like, if we think about risk, how do you, are you even conscious of the risk, right? Because you can't mitigate risk unless you identify it. And so I think that making sure that you're deliberately taking inventory of the risk, and you sort of know what the known risks are, and you try to mitigate those as best you can. And then there's going to be some unknown risk factors, but like us internally, we can just kind of share a little bit about us. When you and I are working on, one of our innovation lab projects, or we're working with someone to scope something out, we have a risk matrix that helps remind us to assess the risk in several different sort of categories. And, some of those things could be, the size of the project, our familiarity with the tech stack, how many towers are we talking about, like, platforms, or how many different, so there's these different variables there. What are the things do you think about that you need to look at if you're trying to size up risk? So if, again, somebody's listening to this, they're like, well, I need to size up our risk. This is a good point. At a high level, just bullet points, what are kind of the big things that you would look at to inspect to try to see if there's risk that needs to be accounted for?
Right. Great question. When you start breaking it down to function points, that's a model that's sort of independent of the technology and really just breaks the project down to inputs, outputs, processing, things like that. So that's one set of risks, right? Those are sort of scale-free quantifications that could be used to determine what does this thing look like, right? Now, obviously, you can start with sort of t-shirt sizing, right? Bigger than a bread style. Function points kind of fall in the middle. And then, you start getting into the very detailed bottoms-up estimation. But, when we talk about this, then we also need to ask ourselves, then simple examples, right? We're talking about things like not just technology risk, market risk, right?
People
right?
risk.
People risk, right? Organizational risk. Regulatory and legal risk is a huge one. There's not a project where that doesn't come up in some form, even if it's only just kind of, GDPR or CCPA compliance.
Yeah.
But it's one that's easy to miss at the outset. Anytime you touch finance, anytime you touch health, right, there's a wide variety of places where you end up with delivery risk because you're having to handle a lot of compliance matters. We start getting to, I think, one of the underplayed risks. We talk about organizational risk, but that also brings us into questions of how many parts of the organization does this touch? How many other software systems does this touch? This is a classic problem, right? Scaled agile style projects, they're notoriously prone to this. Oftentimes because you don't have a single kind of, it's not the most felicitous phrase, but a single throat to choke at the beginning of the project.
Right.
Pulling it. And, I've been on projects where, we had 12 different internal dependencies. These are teams moving independently. It's a big scaled agile project. It's got the whole agile release train going on. And you go to a scrum of scrums. And, this would be a project where, for sake of argument, we'd be doing the mobile app, the web app, something that's customer facing, right?
Yep.
And all of the risk kind of flows to that level, not because necessarily that's the place where the risk exists. It's where the risk emerges. You'd have a scrum of scrums and you'd have 11 teams going, nope, we're green. We're green. We're fine. We're
Until
fine.
they're not.
Exactly, right? You get to front end, and front end's, well, why are you all green when we're red because we're blocked by all of you?
Right.
Well, that's a problem. Yeah. Every time you add, and then this is, one point that I think has been borne out kind of by experience is that when you start adding multiple systems, multiple organizations, right, when you're connecting things together in that way, whether they're separate software projects, departments, any of those complexities, the risk does not add, the risk multiplies. That's something that you have to be aware of. It doesn't mean that it's intractable, but it does mean that, again, during this upfront effort, during the service design, during the solutioning phase, you find those risk points and you say, okay, how do we get those as small as possible? How do we maximize all the liability? Because we know that if we don't, this is going to be a problem for us.
And they cascade, right? Because like once you hit one of those problems, it very often will trickle into other related problems. So you run into one of these issues, and then in order to solve that, you're going to burn budget, you're going to burn time. You may have to back up and go back at sort of designing and redefining how you're going to approach something, which again consumes more budget and time. And then you got that pressure building where there's a deadline or an expectation that's been set, where you're having to request more budget, and it gets more and more painful, right? So it's not just the item by itself to solve, it sort of compounds because these other problems come along with it.
Exactly. It's a geometric collision.
It is.
People think about, large government projects are kind of a classic scapegoat because we see them played out in public. We don't see, generally speaking, the private company failures.
Right.
No, I'm not calling out, public service here specifically. I think it's just that we see those failures. But, if you look at that, almost always those issues arise because of those sorts of geometric risk collisions from a lot of moving parts. And sometimes, it's, I don't want to say it's as simple as, but, it's as classic as one particular piece is not load bearing in the way it needs to be, and everything collapses. Things like, again, not to call out any particular vendor, but, we've seen some major federal projects fail because Oracle Identity Manager wasn't really set up to scale in the direction that needed to. All of these, that's not a hit on Oracle. They've got a lot of products, but, it's one place where you can look at that and say, okay, one load-bearing piece didn't quite make it, and everything fell under the pit after
Causes
that.
problems elsewhere. Yeah. Let's shift a little bit. We mentioned briefly a few minutes ago about people, right? And so having the right team is really important. If we for a moment kind of focus more on smaller teams, let's say teams that are 5 to 10 people, right? When you see that a project is having issues, and let's say you kind of airdrop into it and you're kind of assessing the team, what are some of the sort of common skill sets or capabilities that you're going to want to take inventory of to make sure are present?
That's an interesting one. It's with the larger projects, it's easier to go in, and oftentimes just because of the cost of failure is so high that it's oftentimes okay, let's take a beat. We're going to build a larger governance project around this, right? So taking a large project into turnaround is ironically in some ways easier because you have the ability to throw more resources at the problem.
It's true.
Are a bit more challenging in that way. I think with smaller projects, it's really a great question. Oftentimes if a smaller team project is in jeopardy, I think there's a combination of things that you want to look at. The first one seems very simple, but it is frequently an issue, and it's what we've been talking about through this conversation, which is, do the programmers, the developers understand what they're doing? A lot of times they simply don't, right? And that's because we have uncaptured requirements. It's because they don't understand the business at, the actual operational level. But there's a lot of cases where you'll see developers kind of disappear down technical rabbit holes and chew up a lot of time, and chew up a lot of costs, simply because they don't really understand where they're going. So that's the first thing, right? Is it's an alignment question. Do you all understand the North Star? The second one is really to ask, okay, who owns different features, right? That's second problem is look at developers and say, have we drawn lines around different parts of the system so we understand the RASI matrix, right?
Right.
Who's accountable? Who has dependencies and needs to be consulted or informed on, right? The RASI matrix is a very simple tool. It's a very
Right.
powerful. And when you couple that with sort of a domain-driven approach, to be able to say, okay, who owns different parts of the system, who has that knowledge, who has that accountability, responsibility, then you start to be able to say, okay, if we're running into problems, here's who we go to. Horizontal communication then becomes the issue, right? Are the developers communicating with each other? A lot of times you'll find that, the devs aren't directly communicating, or everything's being sort of mediated through the daily stand-up. And there's a lot of cases where that creates sort of these long turnaround times, right? So, in a small team, you need to have a lot of very, very dense communication networks. Because otherwise you're sort of, you're sort of making yourself the servant of the release cadence, which is not where you want to be. You want to be moving a little faster, a little more agile inside that sprint.
That makes sense.
The other one really is what is your governance, right? Who is responsible for building those feature requirements, right? That's a design-led, big D design, right? Not visual design, but that's service design. Who's responsible for owning those? Who's building the roadmap for that? Who's communicating internally and externally with your customers? How does that connect over to project management, right? I mean, if you just, a lot of times people think project management is just sort of synonymous with Scrum Master. And they're not different roles. A Scrum Master is much more tactical, much more about clearing the immediate blockages.
Exactly.
Do you have a burn deck, right? I mean, if you own a project, if you're a startup founder, CEO, a division lead, whatever, a reasonable question to ask, and one that you should be able to get an answer to, is, what are we charging, right? What's our burn down? How fast are we going to get there? What are our milestones along the way?
Yep.
But if you haven't set that up, if you don't have a defined burn down and set of milestones that tells you, here's what we're doing, here's the order we're taking it in, and this is what the release looks like, then, the answer you're going to get is, we don't know.
Right.
And
you're driving in the dark.
You're driving in the dark, right? And it's not fair. It's not fair to the owners. It's not fair to the developers. It's just a case where everyone's sort of trying to get to the far end. Again, there are times where that is not unreasonable. If you are a startup and maybe your developers are kind of in it for the equity, and maybe it's not a full-time deal, right? Maybe it's a part-time thing. We're doing nights and weekends. You got 5 or 6 people. Everybody's basically not drawing a salary. You can afford to do a lot of stumbling around, and that's not in those cases, right? But the more, to be blunt, the more actual money is being invested, the more you really should be focusing on the governance around the project. And that's, if you have a 5-person dev team or a 50-person dev team, that is still one of the most critical places to look when a project goes into trouble, is what is the governance that we have about it.
Awesome.
We've got examples in the wild right now. You know who they are.
Yeah.
Pieces where the technology architecture probably outstrips the team size.
Yeah.
Or I wouldn't say ability, right? I mean, the fact is, so much software these days is developed as commodity software.
What do you mean when you say that? When you say commodity software, what are you referring to?
So that's kind of the corollary to this. It's kind of the other side when I say the technology is rarely the risk, right?
Yeah.
It's, quite frankly, most of the time, we're not doing things that require, to be honest, a lot of, true computer science. Now, some organizations, again, this gets back down to kind of where some startups are, right? One of the interesting things is you can go with what I would characterize as higher risk architectures that leverage more sort of forward bleeding edge type technologies. Yeah. And you get a lot of bang for your buck out of that. You're creating risk because you're not going with the kind of commodity development of, we're going to have some Node.js lambdas, or we're going to shove this in a MySQL database. And, we today have our sort of own version these days of the traditional kind of 3-tier architecture, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of it out there. It's very hard, to be honest, to find developers who can't effectively produce.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah. So, and in some sense, the more exotic or bleeding edge the technology, the higher risk we're talking about, right?
But at the same time, that same risk that you take on in certain cases can let you scale faster. It can let you get to places more effectively. There are definitely places where that sort of bleeding edge technology is appropriate. And I'd say it probably is at like two levels, right? Either the very small startup, again, a case where, you got a couple people, they're in it for equity. There are cases there where saying, we're going to go with something really out of the box.
Yeah.
Because, we can probably get there faster or less expensive, right? I mean, that's we could go with a full kind of cloud native architecture, but, before we get to revenue, our burn rate's going to be $15,000 a month on AWS, right? I mean, so I absolutely see it.
Yeah.
Or you could say, we're going to go with a, custom, really close to the metal kind of approach. And you increase your delivery risk, right? But in those cases, it's probably not a bad idea. The other one is the far end, where you're going with a company that has extensive investments in custom technology and can take advantage of that. Ericsson, they developed the Erlang software at runtime there, which is a massive distributed programming language at runtime, powers their switches and all that stuff. And it's been a huge force multiplier for them. But you've got to be able to put hundreds of people to the project, right? That's sort of, Google is kind of the extreme example.
Yeah.
Right? Not thousands of people whose responsibility it is to maintain, custom programming languages and custom data planes. All that. So that's that's an interesting one to my mind. I think more frequently when we talk about parachuting into projects to try and fix them, I think oftentimes what we see are architectures that may in fact have kind of outstripped the size of the team that is able to maintain them. And one of the reasons for that, not to point fingers at any particular kind of architectural fad, but the proliferation of microservices is something where I've seen small projects really outstrip their ability to manage themselves. And you see kind of less of that. There's been a move towards more what I would call kind of mini monoliths, where, you might have, a small code monolith that is responsible for 15 or 20 endpoints within a domain. Right? That's a little easier to get your arms around.
Yeah.
But I've seen my share of small projects where, it's got hundreds of microservices. And, they took separation to an extreme and everything's running their own databases, right? Every service has its own kind of data store.
Yeah.
And as you're not Netflix, right? I mean, microservices solve as much as anything. I mean, unless you are in a situation like Netflix or Google where you have a very parallelizable problem, then you could fan out amongst thousands of individual microservices.
Yeah.
Most of the time, if you're using microservices, you're trying to solve an organizational problem.
Yeah.
That's why if you go with one of the big players, right, an Accenture or a Deloitte or any of those, they tend to default towards a lot of microservices, a lot of lambdas, a lot of kind of cloud functions as a service, or a lot of, heavy Kubernetes, individual endpoint kind of approaches. But the reason is that you're talking about projects that are going to have dozens to hundreds of developers working on them simultaneously in a pretty distributed environment, right? Very fault on kind of global models. And so what microservices give you in that case is the ability to put a set of developers on an endpoint and say, here's your requirements, here's everything you got to do, here's your contract, right? So here's your API signatures, go build it.
Yeah.
And you can, the organizational problem that you're solving is I have more developers than I know what to do with if I use a traditional kind of monolith or quasi-monolithical approach, right? They'll be stepping on each other. So it's in an environment like that, it gets you where you need to be faster. It gets you where you need to be with a lot of developers, right? You can just sort of throw the army at the problem. But what you're left with is this exceedingly complex architecture with, hundreds or thousands of microservices and a lot of decouplings, and understanding anything requires you to kind of do, complex tracing through sagas, right? And the smaller your organization is, the harder that is to manage, right? You need smaller chunks of code.
Yeah.
And you also see that even in more of a monolithic environment with certain code architectures where, .NET is a bit of an offender in this, where, heavy DAO-based architectures, where to understand what's going on, you have to sift through 5 or 6 different code bases because there's a sort of a lot of magic in there. Back when Java was kind of the flavor of the day, a lot of J2EE, a lot of Spring Boot type stuff. Same way, magic annotations.
Yeah.
I've written a lot of that code. I've been an offender, right? I absolutely have delivered code bases where, if you did not understand the one place where all the magic happens, you have no idea what's going on. But unfortunately, those are really hard to maintain, especially if you're, bringing in new developers and trying to build on top of it. So you can get into cases where, even though I say technology is really rarely the problem, it is possible to have an architecture that outstrips your organization's ability to manage it. And that's a tough one. If you're in a turnaround scenario, that's a hard one.
To turn quickly, right? Yeah, you talked about microservices, and I'm going to give you a warning. I'm probably at the edge of my technical depth. This is where I get dangerous. That's why I need people like you working together. But microservices, as I understand it, can be along a spectrum ranging from microservices that is somewhat simplistic to microservices that's very expansive and complex. And microservices can be a really good approach even for smaller products, but the implementation of how extreme you go with slicing that out makes a big impact on how hard it is to be effective and efficient. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, that is. Never let architectural purity distract you from the problem at hand. And more sort of pure the approach, right? A lot of developers, a lot of architects like to cargo code best practices into projects.
Yeah.
And, the problem that you end up with is, we inevitably kind of end up living in the messy middle regardless.
Yeah.
So attempting to kind of force a very, very pure view of the world on your architecture is a great way to find yourself snarled up.
Yeah.
And realistically, even if you have, even in cases where, you have a purely monolithic environment, right? There's a lot of those out there. There's a lot of PHP monoliths out there. There's a lot of .NET monoliths out there, right? As I keep reminding people, nobody cares what your backend is, right? The customers don't care. Your users don't care.
Yeah.
There's a lot of the world runs on, if nothing else, WordPress, right? Just big monolithic systems. But even then, you're going to find yourself building small special purpose code bases to do things. Because, the problem with a monolith is not that everything's sitting necessarily in one code base. The problem is that it tends to smear responsibility across different parts of the code base.
Yeah.
And,
exactly.
Very, very ugly architectural connections.
And the more you spread it around, the more you increase the risk. And more you increase the risk, more like potential to failure on getting off timelines. I think I'll wrap up like kind of one item that we talked about just a couple minutes ago, and then I know we're getting up against time here, so we'll start to wrap up here. So when we talk about small teams, I think one thing to keep in mind is that something that's unique to smaller product teams versus larger product teams is when you're on a larger product team, you have the luxury of having deep specialists for lots of different niche skills that you need. But in small teams, you still need those skills covered. Like those responsibilities are still there, but what you often have to do is figure out like what people can own those responsibilities, even if their job title or their role isn't specifically for that. So we use Scrum Master as an example. Sometimes in smaller teams, I'll see a Scrum Master also wear the hat of like a business analyst. So they're taking more responsibility for documenting, writing requirements, and working with product management or a product visionary to help, capture requirements, document those, and then they're running scrums, right? So just because you have a smaller team doesn't mean that you don't need those different responsibilities covered. You still do. You just have to make sure that you're very clear about who is the one that's responsible for covering that and ensuring that they have an adequate depth of capability in that particular skill to be able to cover it. The RACI chart may look different because one person's name may be on multiple responsibilities, that kind of stuff, but it still has to be covered. I think being mindful about, okay, who owns architecture? Like who's the one the final say? Who's the one that owns, the user experience? Who's the one that owns the budget, the scope? Who's the one that owns front end? Who's the one that owns back end? Who owns testing? Those things might fall like under, like one person might have multiple roles, but you have to be clear on who it is that owns those, even as a small team.
That's a great point. Yeah, absolutely. And, that's one thing, right? In a very large team, your org chart is your destiny, right? We have a lot of moral hazards in projects. It's just the nature of it, right? People have conflicting goals, conflicting interests, and your org chart in a large project can be arranged in ways to kind of minimize those conflicts and kind of align everybody around where you need. In a small team, it's really a lot more about collaboration and communication. Again, those communication networks I'm talking about. And that's something where it becomes important to make sure that you have a single voice that can control all of those voices underneath. Because you're absolutely right. When you're sort of wearing multiple hats, you've got to be able to ensure that that you have a high degree of collaboration to avoid kind of what I'd say kind of the mini tyrant syndrome, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
When we talk about these technical multi-hat roles, there's something really interesting, and you see this with smaller projects. You see this with smaller teams, especially when they're operating in areas that might be fairly complex and fairly specialized. You might not have a specialist, but what you're going to have are generalist developers who might be able to flex to cover that. And so whether it's a project in turnaround or whether it's sort of building from the ground up, in those sorts of smaller projects, it becomes really important to do lots of frequent technical spikes, right? You're going to test technical hypotheses. You're going to put your developers on those. You're going to see how they perform. You're going to see how it works, right? So that's appropriate for like a very, very high tempo agile project where we're going to build a lot of code and some of it's going to move the needle. And the stuff that works may work for 2 or 3 sprints, but then we have to pull it back in, right? That's a lot of kind of fail fast and keep moving forward. And so the more that you are working with small teams where people are having to handle multiple specialties, that becomes a very, very effective way to both build out, or if a project is a need turnaround, it's an effective way to kind of test hypotheses and say, okay, where are we inside this phase?
Got it. Yeah. And when you say tech spikes, for those that aren't familiar with that term, that's kind of a proof of concept, for lack of a better term, right?
Absolutely right. It's basically taking a very, very small amount of code, a very small bounded domain, and trying to build something useful out of it.
Yep. Aimed at a key leverage point, right? I think that's the importance of when we do tech spikes, we try to figure out, back to talking about risk, where's the technical risk, and can we use a tech spike to sort of defuse that risk or at least get better clarity on it?
Exactly. That's a huge value of that, is that if you can identify those risk points during the solutioning phase, then getting in, running tech spikes, testing them, seeing which ones work, seeing which ones don't. What you're really doing is you're saying at the outset of the project, we're going to take a few weeks. We're going to, do lots of small experiments. The ones that survive, that's going to shape what we do over the next month, year, however long the project is.
So, Craig, as we start to wrap up today, I think a few things come to mind just to summarize that when your project's not on track, or product development effort in general is not on track, governance is a really good place to sort of start, and that can be kind of broad. A big part of governance is examining scope and how clear you are on what you're trying to achieve and sort of the timeline for that and the budget associated to that. We find it so many times that a key culprit is easily identified as like a lack of scope or a lack of clear documented scope. And then things trickle off of that. And if you can't define the scope, you can't manage it. And if you can't manage it, you can't control the budget, can't control the timeline, can't control expectations, and things get really bad from there. We talked about some of the technical risk, being able to assess risk associated to a project. And that's not just technical risk, that's all kinds of other different types of risks that we talked about, quite a bit of detail. We talked a little bit about culture and people and the skill sets required on the team. So I think there's a lot of different elements that we have in there. Do you have any parting thoughts as we kind of wrap up here? Any last minute, like words of advice, things that you think may be actionable or that somebody can put into action if they're currently in a situation right now where their product's not really on the rails?
Sure. Well, I think the easy answer is call ENO8, but
there you go.
But really, it's rarely is failure sort of come from one single place. You really do have to take a holistic view at a project that's in turnaround and really turn over every rock you can, look in every nook and cranny. I think it's very easy, and developers, of course, love looking at past developers and deciding that that's the problem. But, your people are rarely the problem. The organization that they sit in, the way they're communicating, the existence of the requirements, those are the things that really determine success or failure. And so it's a complex approach, right? But it's one that is, very few projects are past the point of resting.
Yeah.
And there's always an option. There's always
That's right. And sometimes don't be afraid to hit the pause button. We've done some work on that in some of our past episodes. We've written about it before, but the power of a well-timed pause, sometimes pausing, putting the pencils down, regrouping, and making sure you're clear on what the issues are and what your plan of attack is can save you a lot of pain and get you to your goal a lot faster. So, just as a reminder, we do have a project rescue offering at ENO8 where we can help with kind of assessing a situation and giving sort of clarity around where the issues are and even a plan for sort of working out of that and getting it back on track. So if you're currently in a situation where you have a project that's not going well or your product development team just isn't where you really hope, that's something that we can definitely help with. Reach out to us. We'd be happy to help. And Craig, I want to say thank you again. I appreciated you hopping on here and spend a little time talking through this stuff. Me and you work together a lot off camera, and it was fun to chat here and capture a recording that we can share with everybody and hopefully share something that'll be valuable to you folks out there.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Thanks, Craig.